добрый вечер. Практически все, наверное, знают, кто я, но если вы не знаете, меня зовут Диана Поповский-Вест, я директор Центра исследований технологий в Европейском университете Санкт-Петербурге. Я рада приветствовать вас вот на второй лекции из нашего весеннего цикла и, наверное, уже третье мероприятие, которое за последний год посвящено городским инфраструктурам и пересечениям с областью исследований науки и технологий, СТС. Я перейду на английский язык, чтобы представить нашего гостя сегодня. I'm going to switch into English now.
You could be saying anything.
I actually didn't introduce you yet, so I'm about to. But we're very pleased to welcome here Hanna Knox, who is a lecturer in digital anthropology and material culture at UCL, at University College of London. Hanna got her PhD from the University of Manchester many years ago. Well, not many years ago. Sorry. But her PhD was in the study of new media, startups, and economic development organization, which looked at cultural imaginaries associated with the promise of ICTs and the ways in which new media technologies were framing certain ideas about economy, exchange and work in Britain, but then she wore many other hats. She worked at the Manchester Business School on a project looking at the role of information and communication technologies in managing the problem of knowledge in large multinational organizations. And then she joined the ESRC, Center for Research on Sociocultural Change at the University of Manchester, where she conducted work on road construction in Peru, on engineering in the UK, and some of the climate change activities that you're now going to talk about. I also wanted to flag that down at the SDF Center we have this book that Hanna wrote together with Penny Harvey, who was supposed to be here, but she couldn't come in the spring, but she will be here in November. But the book is downstairs for those of you who want to take a look at it. I don't think it's available in digital formats yet, so this may be one of our few opportunities. And we have a signed copy. So today you're going to present, Hannah's going to present some of the recent work that has to do with climate change, and without further ado,
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Diana and Olga, for inviting me here and being like wonderful hosts over the last couple of days, introducing me to the kind of great set of projects that your students are doing, and it's really great to be here. So what I want to do in today's talk is really to kind of take you into a description of data politics in the city. And in a bit of a similar way to those of you who were at Sophie's talk yesterday, I'm going to start with kind of the first half of the talk being a bit of a discussion about what the conversations have been in urban studies and generally about the role that data is playing in the city, and about some different kinds of perspectives that we might take to think about the relationship between cities and data. And then in the second half of the talk, I'm going to draw on the specific research that I've been doing in the last kind of 3 or 4 years, which is on data associated with climate change policy in the urban setting of Manchester in the UK. Okay. So I'll start then with this kind of image of the smart city. Started to talk about with some of you already. And there's been a kind of like emerging kind of conversation about smart cities over the past kind of few years in urban studies. So in an attempt then to make cities more legible for various different kinds of constituents and various different kinds of populations and policymakers, cities have begun to be fitted with all kinds of sensors that are capable of measuring a number of different kinds of urban activity. So you have sensors that are monitoring air pollution, you have technologies that are monitoring and visualizing traffic flow, you have other kinds of systems that are dealing with noise levels. So these are kind of municipal forms of kind of data collection. Then, kind of on top of this, nowadays people themselves are carrying around their own kind of mobile sensing devices in the form of smartphones and devices like fitness trackers that start to be able to monitor and track human behaviour in the city as well. So tracking people's footsteps, movements, communication activities. Layered onto this, then, you have cars that are driving around cities, which are increasingly becoming kind of computationally augmented. We have buses that now have GPS capabilities, buildings that have automatic climate control centres that enable windows to open and close, air conditioning to come on and off according to thermostatic triggers. Okay, so with the advent then of all these kinds of multiple different layers and sites of monitoring, I think this is kind of why the idea of the smart city has really kind of emerged. So the city then is becoming kind of talked about and defined as a producer of huge amounts of information. And then, in the wake of this information, comes a promise that if only this information that kind of is flooding or flowing around us could be harnessed, then urban spaces would become more comprehensible to people, they might become more manageable to people, they could become more sustainable, and they even might become more equitable. These are some of the kind of discourses of smart cities. Now, this kind of appearance on the scene of the smart city seems to me to open up some kind of important questions about big issues that have been posed within urban studies regarding who or what are the forces that shape contemporary urban experience. So smart city kind of conversations and technologies seem to me to raise the question of precisely what role information and data has to play in the kind of politics of urban space, in how kind of cities operate as sites for political action, political processes, something that Diana was asking us about maybe earlier about politics. So is the role of data primarily one of information, of informing urban policy? Is information a way of defining urban problems? Should we think about data as a method for making arguments for particular kinds of political ambitions? Or on the other hand, should we kind of pay attention to the ways in which data practices enable people to escape forms of control in order to produce kind of newly emancipated urban practices? Who is it that determines what kind of data cities are producing? Who is it who's determining what kinds of data is important? Who's managing and controlling this data? And ultimately, what can the kinds of answers to these questions tell us about who are the agents that are responsible for the transformation and reformulation of urban space? Okay, so there's already been some work kind of conducted in this vein that begins to try to answer some of these questions. So first of all, I want to draw attention to a seminal book in urban studies that was published in 2001 by the geographers Stephen Graham and Simon Marvin called Splintering Urbanism. Now, in this book, Graham and Marvin hint at the effect that digital technologies might be having on the transformation of urban space and of kind of urban problems. Now, I think they're critical of perspectives that would see data as merely information that's being used by policymakers to further pre-formed agendas. So I think they would differentiate themselves from people who've focused on the production of urban data through things like survey methods and statistical methods that have been used by policymakers. And through their comparative analysis of the role of information systems, in a broader shift in the way in which cities are organised, they start to kind of draw attention to some of the other ways in which information is part of urban politics. Now, in Graham and Marvin's argument, information technologies and the kinds of sensor technologies I was mentioning a minute ago have been kind of a key part of a process of what they call splintering urbanism that they say has kind of been taking place since the 1960s. So the basic argument is something that is kind of along the lines that since the mid-20th century, cities have kind of broadly moved from being locations that were conceived as being designed by government planners, by principles of kind of modernist master planning, to locations that are now formed by a kind of complex interplay between capital interests, state interventions, local civic actions, and the kinds of technologies that we find in smart cities. And the focus of their book that I think is particularly interesting for this group is the way in which they look very intensely at the different kinds of infrastructures that exist in the city and the role of infrastructures in making the city into a much more kind of fragmented space. Now, for Graham and Marvin, digital technologies play an important role in the latter stages of this process of kind of splintering or fragmentation, as they've enabled infrastructures to develop in much more data-driven and potentially kind of abstracted ways. So an example might be something like road planning or highway planning, where information collected on road usage by by traffic monitors begins to allow for the active management of vehicle speeds and provides a way to increase the capacity of an infrastructure like a road without actually having to build new roads, and that there's a kind of cost reduction principle at play here. So what they're arguing by talking about these kinds of examples is that we move from a situation where we have planners who have a kind of master vision of what the city should be, through to a situation where the social order of the city seems to kind of emerge out of another kind of commitment, which is to a technical, managerial, and digitally enabled mode of government. So it's this kind of move that Graham and Marvin call splintering urbanism, and they're particularly interested in its divisive effect, so how it ends up separating the city out into different kinds of spaces of wealth and poverty, how some people have access to certain infrastructure and other people don't have access to those infrastructures, and they're very interested in the politics of that. Okay, so when we consider smart cities and data practices in the city, it's crucial then that we consider them in the context of this kind of discussion that Graham and Marvin put on the table about the idea that the city is a kind of fragmented space. Now, I want to kind of touch on some of the discussions that have taken place in urban studies over the past few years, which talk about what kinds of causes we might attribute this splintering of urbanism to, in order to kind of expand Graham and Marvin's approach to see what other ways we might kind of approach the role that data has played in this splintering process. So firstly, we have Marxist-influenced urban theorists led by scholars like David Harvey, who I think argue that this splintering of urban space can be put down to the spread of what we might call capitalist or neoliberal forms of structuring social relations. People like Neil Brenner and his colleagues have argued that it's really important that we don't lose sight of key concepts in kind of political economy, such as capital accumulation, class, property relations, commodification, structured coherence, crisis formation, and they kind of talk about a series of kind of concepts that have been developed out of Marxist political economy that they think are absolutely crucial to understanding this process of fragmentation that's taken place in the city. So, in terms of data then, what if we take this kind of Marxist political economy approach, that raises the question of, within that kind of approach, what are the roles that data has been playing in producing this kind of splintered urbanism? And I think it, in particular, draws our attention to practices such as audit, managerialism, and kind of accountants, sorry, I lost the word there, and practices of accountancy. Now, as sociologists and anthropologists of finance have shown, data is really central to the operation of contemporary financial markets. It's key to understanding how assets get valued. It's crucial to the processes by which companies and infrastructures themselves get bought and sold, and how these kinds of processes of kind of political economy come into being. There have been quite a few studies of audit that I think are useful for thinking about data in this frame, and they've critiqued the way in which data and information allow or enable the spread of neoliberal governmentality as a particular kind of mode of producing cities, at least in Western European settings. So data in its capacity to abstract and make things of different orders equivalent to each other, so make everything kind of potentially reducible to numerical judgment, numerical kind of categorization, seems to extend the logic of capital accumulation into ever new domains, making new areas the subject of capital expansion. So in cities, this takes the form of the privatization of public housing and transport infrastructure. It takes the form of things like the marketization of healthcare, the financialization of natural resources through things like environmental accounting and ecosystem services. Now, one of the kind of arguments is that the capacity of cities to produce data about themselves might be offering a kind of extension of these accounting practices, both at the level of the kind of individual citizen, where people become self-managing agents of their own kind of data that they're collecting, and up to the scale of the entire city, which also gets managed in these kinds of abstracted accountancy ways, turning the city into a kind of neoliberal urban marketplace of goods and services. Okay, so that's the kind of political economy version of why the cities become fragmented and the role that data might be, the way in which people have started to think about how data plays into those kinds of processes. On the other hand, as I think you're kind of all very kind of attuned to here, there's an alternative discussion that has emerged that argues that to attribute the urban form to the spread of neoliberal capitalism or to kind of big political economic processes is problematic because it relies on kind of conceptual black boxes which we can blame contemporary urban ills on. So things like class, things like capital, neoliberalism are kind of presented as black boxes that we don't sufficiently interrogate. So in order to reinstate the complexity, the multiplicity of the current urban situation, some of the people you've invited here, Colin McFarlane, Ignacio Farias, Tom Bender, have argued that we should reinvigorate urban theory through assemblage urbanism. So they argue that we shouldn't see the city just as determined by a set of external logics or structures that we might name capitalism or neoliberalism, but rather we need to see the city as this kind of complex outcome of an array of relationships between humans and non-human agents. And as I think we probably know here, central to this assemblage urbanism is the importance of exploring the role of materials and different kinds of material agency in the making of the city. So the city then is described empirically as opposed to kind of structurally. It's often described in quite kind of ethnographic and local terms as the result of a complex, emergent interplay of interest, practices and histories. Okay, so what does this mean? What would the analysis of data in the city, in the kind of frame of assemblage urbanism, look like? So, like Sophie, who talked a little bit about Latour's Paris Invisible City last night, I want to draw attention to it for a bit of a different reason to the way in which Sophie was talking about it, in that I think it's quite an interesting case of what data looks like in an assemblage urbanism kind of frame. So this was a project conducted by Bruno Latour with some collaborators whose names, unfortunately, I haven't written down. Hennant. Is that right? Thank you. And it was a project that attempted to describe Paris, not in terms of these kinds of structures or overarching forces, but in terms of a description of a complex and unfolding set of material relationships. And the project's very compelling, and as you navigate this online website that pulls the project together, you are kind of put into this experimental space where you can explore urban sites in a way that never allows you to get a kind of picture of the whole city. So Bruno Latour is kind of very interested in how the scaling effects of the city are produced through different kind of assemblages of objects, both material and digital. Much of the project focuses on the role that data plays in people's kind of experiences of making and representing the city. So in the project, as you kind of navigate through it, you're led into various different spaces, including things like the offices of university administrators who are sat in front of a terminal, looking at the timetable of classes. And then we're taken to the meteorological office where weather forecasters are producing maps of the weather of Paris. And then we're taken into a cafe where you see two people sitting negotiating a bill, and you have the kind of material artifact of the bill, which is also a kind of data artifact as well. And through this kind of juxtaposition of different kinds of images of the city, they kind of conjure a sense of what it's like to be in Paris. So the project shows then how the city is assembled, not only through these kind of concrete material artifacts that I think a lot of assemblage urbanism tends to focus on, but are also layered through relationships with data. And through this kind of navigation, Latour's and Hanna are able to argue that there is no one city. So the book's called Paris, Invisible City. It's based, that's a kind of reference to Italo Calvino's novel Invisible Cities, which similarly told the tale of Marco Polo's travels through the kind of East, and he tells the story of all these cities that he's visited, and in the end we're told that every city that's described in the book is just another version of Venice, his home city, and so that Paris Invisible Cities is this kind of multiplicitous version of Paris that can never be captured as one single thing. Okay, so data then, from the perspective of this assemblage urbanism, I think is not only seen as a technique that can kind of enable and further this parasitism of neoliberal market principles. Rather here we see data as presented as another kind of material artifact, which is, like other material artifacts, produced out of specific arrangements of people and things, which have particular histories, which have competing agendas. I think it's fair to say that data is kind of presented as a material like any other in a sense, and then this allows us to see how data becomes mobilized in a way that produces different urban possibilities. Data isn't good or bad, it's just part of the furniture that makes the contemporary city. Okay, so we've got here like two quite different ways, I think, of thinking about the role that data is playing in producing, responding to, and extending this splintering of contemporary cities. In the first case, we have it as something that's used to achieve a kind of particular kind of value, following a kind of neoliberal logic. And in the second, we have data as this material that produces multiple ways of navigating and describing urban space. Okay, so before I go on to talk about my own research, I just want to consider one final perspective that I think is quite interesting in terms of kind of having another take on data in the city, because sometimes this assemblage urbanism, political economy is kind of switched back and forth. And that is to consider a more kind of Foucauldian approach to thinking about data in the splintered city. So I think the sociologist Jennifer Gabrice has been doing some quite interesting work in this respect. So she's focused particularly on the smart city, and she's done so through the lens of Foucault's late lectures at the Collège de France, where he himself started to explore the concept of neoliberal governmentality, albeit in a kind of rather unfinished and kind of up for grabs kind of way. So she analyses the smart city as what she calls a kind of dispositif, to use a Foucauldian term, which, as she puts it, performs material political relations across speculative designs, technological imaginaries, an urban development plan. So she pays a lot of attention to the kind of imagination of the city rather than its kind of material instantiation. So she talks about how smart cities are oriented towards the goals of sustainability. And in particular, she's interested in how ideas about the smart city mobilize a concept of citizenship that she says is quite different to the way in which citizens have been kind of imagined in urban spaces previously. So she describes then how citizens are mobilized into processes of urban governance by these practices of monitoring the city through digital sensory technologies such as air quality monitors. She's interested in kind of citizen science projects, the requirement to kind of mobilize citizens as people who are actively engaged in monitoring or who produce data for the city through their kind of participation in city processes, so by having a mobile phone or by traveling with their smart card or whatever. And what Jennifer Gabrice argues is that these digital devices re-articulate citizenship, not as something that you find in the individual, not as a kind of subject position of a particular person in the city, but as something that kind of traverses the city. So she says citizens are no longer the holders of knowledge, rather the knowledge that constitutes citizen power, the kind of capacity of citizens to make a difference, is like distributed across informational infrastructures. It's no longer in the individual. So she argues then that these digital monitoring technologies are part of a process by which citizenship is what she calls made environmental. It's made part of the milieu. It's kind of distributed across the city through these information networks. So yeah, she says that citizenship is something that's articulated through distribution and feedback of monitoring devices. So this is quite interesting. It's a little bit different to either the political economy approach or the assemblage urbanism approach to data. Because she's sort of saying that the fragmentation of contemporary cities shouldn't be conceived as manifested simply in an arrangement or an assemblage of people and things, but rather that actually data has really powerful constitutive effects on who or what counts as a political agent in the city. So how we can, not just on kind of ontologically who has the capacity to act politically, whether, you know, a traffic light has agency, but actually how political positions become defined. Okay. So with these kind of three different perspectives on data in the city in mind, then I want to turn now to the role that data is playing in the kind of formation of urban experience by describing some of the data practices that I encountered during fieldwork that I've been conducting in Manchester in the UK since 2007. Okay, so I'm kind of concerned a little bit like Gabrice, so I wouldn't like go as Foucauldian as she does, but I'm concerned with what data is doing to practices of governing. And whereas she focuses on citizens, I suppose I'm interested in the people who kind of self-identify as making the city, and that it's their responsibility to govern and shape the city, in particular in the context of climate change. So the focus of my description then is on the way in which various different people who are positioned in this kind of field of governmental practice, who include council officers, they include university academics, they include independent consultants, how they're working with and exploring the role of data in order to produce a kind of field of intervention that they see as the sustainable city. Okay. So Manchester, Manchester's long seen itself as a place that's really at the forefront of technological and indeed digital development. So in kind of narratives that are told about what the city is for its population, what its history is, we're often told that computing is really central to the self-identity of the city. As a city, it was home to the inventor Alan Turing, who's famous for the artificial intelligence, for the Turing test. It was the site of the invention of the first programmable computer, stored program computer, by Tom Kilburn and Freddie Williams. And it was also an early supporter of high-speed digital infrastructure, which was put in the city in order to tackle the kind of risk or threat of the digital divide, that people would be left out from the digital development. And this was the context in which my own kind of doctoral research on the new media industry kind of took place. Nowadays, 10 years on from the doctoral research I was doing, Manchester's still kind of actively engaged in debates about the role that data might play in the future governance of the city. Current projects that are underway to monitor and map and measure the city include things like an experimental urban laboratory called Corridor Manchester that began in 2010. This project is a collaboration between universities and local authorities that aims to produce what they say is a compact, transit, accessible and technically wired innovation district to foster open collaboration, grow talent and offer mixed-use housing, office and retail. Other initiatives include things like Open Data Manchester, a kind of activist collective which aims to support the sharing of data by public institutions in the city. Another group is a local hack space called Mad Lab that provides a venue through which bottom-up forms of data collection and distribution can also be practiced. Manchester is also trying to become a smart city, as many cities around the world are also trying to do, and it's recently got funding to be the UK's Internet of Things demonstrator city, and they've got £10 million of public and private funding to develop that project. Okay, so we have this kind of data conversation, computing data conversation going on in Manchester. But at the same time, one thing that's quite interesting is that all of the projects that I've mentioned, and I haven't kind of picked them out specifically but for this reason, but all of the projects that I've mentioned also are quite explicitly oriented to supporting an agenda of ecological sustainability. So the Corridor Manchester project is very kind of celebratory about an initiative that they're running called iTrees, which is looking at the role that trees can play in tackling climate change. And that involves using trees to monitor air pollution as well as thinking about trees in urban space. Open Data Manchester's work to track food consumption and food miles in the city in order to think about whether local food networks might be possible. Mad Lab, the hack space, runs events that aim to help people reduce their carbon emissions by doing things like building smart meters and using online tools to monitor their energy use. And even the Internet of Things demonstrator talks explicitly about improving health, reducing energy consumption, and encouraging use of public transport and bicycles with a sustainability kind of focus. Okay, so data and sustainability are both really important at the moment in Manchester, and they're also seem to kind of have an interesting relationship with one another. I think this kind of points to, if we're thinking about the city as a kind of splintered or fragmented space, I think it maybe is quite interesting to consider climate change and the kind of projections about climate change as a new or different kind of way of thinking about people's anxieties about the future kind of fragmentation or incoherence of the city. And climate change poses a threat to urban spaces, and it also opens up new possibilities for different kinds of collaborations, different kinds of partnerships to rewire urban infrastructure. Okay, so, cities kind of globally have been articulated as really important sites for thinking about global climate change. It's often kind of rolled out the statistic that more than 50% of the world's population now live in cities. And there's an argument that's frequently made that because of that, if anywhere, it's cities that should be worrying about the effects of things like rising sea levels, flooding, food shortages, and heat waves that are going to affect the populations of these places. And at the same time, cities are also the place where the burning of fossil fuels takes place. So clearly it takes place in other places, but there's very much a focus on cities as like problematic sites for the production of carbon emissions. Yeah, either as a result of transportation or of manufacturing or direct or indirectly through urban consumption of commodities. So as a result of this kind of understanding of the role that cities are playing in the discussions about climate change, city authorities have come to have a big part to play in tackling climate change. We have international groups like the C40 Cities Group. We have European organisations like the Covenant of Mayors, which is a network of cities in some thousands of cities in Europe who are also kind of talking about how to reduce carbon emissions and tackle climate change. So, since around 2009, Manchester has also positioned itself as a city that's committed to mitigating and adapting to climate change, and for various reasons. Firstly, there's been a number of very kind of public, influential individuals in the city who have made a public commitment to incorporating environmental issues into Manchester's future planning. There's been pressure from environmental groups like Friends of the Earth, who've been actively involved in drawing up strategic plans that commit the city to carbon reduction commitments. At the same time, there's been broader kind of national regulations. In the UK, there was something called National Indicator 186 that was put in place, which obliged all local authorities to report on their carbon emissions. This was part of a kind of National Climate Change Act that was brought in 2008. Okay, so making a commitment then to protect residents by either adapting to climate change and reducing carbon emissions is one thing, but to actually know how to do this and to be accountable for one's interventions is another. And I think it's for this reason that it really quickly became clear to the people who were involved in this urban project of tackling climate change in Manchester that data was going to be absolutely crucial to this work. Data was going to be the means by which they could make this kind of risky, fragmented city recohere. Data needed to be able to cross public and private boundaries. There was an expectation that data would enable communication between politicians and citizens, that it would inform inform local government about the strategic direction they should be taking in the face of this otherwise uncertain future. It would provide people working on this problem with a baseline upon which to measure their activities and to know whether or not they'd even been successful. So one of the projects that was set up to begin to think about how Manchester could respond to climate change was a collaboration between Manchester University, the local council, and the charitable arm of a commercial property management company in the city. The project was called Green Futures. Okay, so the purpose of this project was first of all to determine what are the future impacts of climate change, which we have global models for. What are the impacts going to be on Manchester? And secondly, then, to lay out a blueprint of how the city should prepare itself for the future climate that it had in store. So the project then was an exercise partly in data production about an issue for which there wasn't really a great deal of understanding, the likely future impacts of climate change in the city. And as a project, it explicitly tried to produce and collate data on Manchester's climate future. So one arm of this project was dedicated to producing models of climate change that were relevant to the specific geographical area of Manchester. Now, one of the issues that they were facing at the time was that climate models that were available had only been able to produce data that was accurate to grid squares of 100 square kilometres. And this is a kind of grid square of 100 square kilometres. Now, in 2009, an organisation called the UK Climate Impacts Programme had started to provide data at a smaller scale of 25 square kilometres. But people who were working on trying to work out what were the impacts of climate change how are they going to be differentially distributed across the city were worrying about the fact that even 25 square kilometres didn't take into account the variability of weather on a very local scale. So they felt that this was too generic a scale to inform local policies. There was a kind of mismatch between the scale of climate modelling and the scale of local policy. And so what they were trying to do is they were trying to kind of rescale climate models to a level that was comprehensible and useful to policymakers. And they wanted to make a kind of relationship between climate models and understandings of the weather in Manchester down to the level of just 5 square kilometres, or ultimately they were aiming to get down to these grid squares of 1 square kilometre. So the way in which they did this was by cross-referencing climate model projections at a larger geographical scale with actual weather information that had been collected over the past, between 1961 and 1990 for the area of Manchester. So the first job was to kind of get this picture of climatic variability between 1961 and 1990 within Manchester, and then relate that to the climate models under different kinds of projection scenarios in order to see what would the effects of these different scenarios be on different areas within the city. So producing data then was a matter of actually aligning different data sources that already existed in order to make this new scale of urban climate knowledge. So I spoke to the scientists who were working on this, and one of them explained some of the difficulties that she was facing in this process of alignment. Her main concern was that since the 1970s, data on local climate was very poor, and this ended up being because of the closure of local weather centres. So what she had was a situation where there was very kind of pockmarked data over the period that she was looking at. So to quote her, she said, I had a huge problem trying to find climate data, for example, for the station near Chester Zoo. They were doing some work on the kind of future impacts of climate for tourist attractions, and one of them was Chester Zoo. Because there were 3 weather stations located around it, but you could guarantee the first one I chose finished in 1995, the second one then carried on and stopped in about 2004, and then there was another one, and then there was a 5-year overlap which was still current today. So it's like a bit of a nightmare finding actual weather data that was at the right scale. Okay, so Elena was one of the kind of problems that she was finding was that she had to work with this data, but she was separated from the sites of data collection, both kind of practically but also historically. This data had been collected at a time when no one was anticipating the uses to which it would need to be put in the future. It wasn't her job to collect new data, rather she was trying to collate and cross-reference data from already existing sources. So she was conducting what I kind of came to think of or term a retro-analysis of old data. And through doing so, she was having to kind of analyse the historical processes of data collection in a way that's a bit similar to what the science scholar Paul Edwards calls infrastructural inversion, understanding the history of infrastructure through the analysis of data. So the difficulty in finding data for the specific purposes of a particular project was not just Elena's problem. Although, actually in the kind of discourse of smart cities, quite a lot of of the focus of that discussion is on what's going to be possible when we're confronted with all these new forms of data. But what's often less talked about is all the work that goes into aligning data that's actually available with the data that people need in order to tell particular stories in particular settings. So for Elena, her struggle was to make this data move across scales, making global data speak to local or regional policy concerns. And this was kind of far from seamless. Okay, so I'm going to go on to a second example now, which I think kind of also illustrates how collecting data around this question of kind of climate change and sustainability was also inflected with these questions of like how to make sense of gaps and how to align data that didn't fit. So the second example concerns not climate models, but attempts to actually reduce the carbon emissions of the city of Manchester. So the form of data that was being required here was an estimation of the city's carbon footprint. Now this was based on what are called direct emissions, so emissions that come from the burning of fossil fuels either in the city itself or the fossil fuels that are burnt to produce the electricity that's used by people who live in the city. So in Manchester, a lot of focus had been put on the role that, that's the smaller scale of blocks from the climate maps. A lot of emphasis had been put on determining the role that buildings had to play in reducing carbon emissions in the city. So one of the pie charts that was often shown was this one, which demonstrated how buildings were the biggest culprit for carbon emissions in the city. And this was kind of often used as justification for why so much work in the city was happening on buildings. I've written elsewhere on some of the politics of this carbon footprinting methodology, because there was also underway at the time an argument that a completely different method should be used for measuring carbon emissions based on the consumption of goods rather than on energy burnt. And in that, very different areas of activity became important. But for now, I'm going to focus on buildings. So, at the City Council, one of the officers working in environmental issues had responsibility for reducing carbon emissions in the city's housing stock. Now, in the UK, most of the houses in the city, many houses in the city used to be under public ownership. But since the 1980s, a lot of that ownership has been transferred to housing associations, which are kind of charitable or private organisations. Now, this kind of social housing owned by housing associations accounts for about 25% of Manchester's housing, and the rest are owned by either private individuals or are privately rented by landlords. But even in spite of this, because of the commitments to carbon reduction that the City Council had signed up to, the council itself still felt that it had a responsibility to work with and support residents of private houses and residents of housing associations to reduce their carbon emissions. So during my fieldwork, I went to talk to the council officer who was in charge of carbon emissions of houses. And as Jeremy and I began to discuss issues facing his work to increase the energy efficiency of these domestic buildings, he began to talk, just like Elena, about the difficulties he faced with the gaps in his data. Unlike the scientists, he wasn't working with global or predictive data, but he'd been confronted similarly by the need for new sets of data fields that had become relevant in the context of climate change. As I sat with Jeremy, he pulled out a spreadsheet in order to demonstrate where the gaps about their knowledge of buildings lay. So he said to me as he pulled this out, "You know, you'd be amazed, or maybe you wouldn't, that we don't even know what Manchester's housing stock is." So he was like, so frustrating. So I was saying, well, what do you mean you don't know what the housing stock is? And so he showed me this. And this was one page of a report that was produced by the Energy Saving Trust for the local authority area of Manchester. So this is a kind of governmental organisation that provides advice on energy saving. And there were 8 tables which had different categories of property. So property type, what the tenure of the property is, like who's living in it, property age, glazing type, main heating systems, main heating fuel, external wall type, and loft insulation. Now, the tables had all been filled in with as much of the data as it could be for Manchester. And on the bottom of each table was the category unknown. So for tenure type, which is a kind of category that's been used for a long time for thinking about housing, only 27% of properties came under the unknown category. But as we got to things like glazing type or external wall type or insulation, which were the kinds of things that Jeremy was interested in, the number of kind of unknown properties went up to 67%, 50%, 55%. And he was grappling with this kind of problem of these big gaps in his data. So we have Elena then, who is tackling the problem of how to retro-analyse data over whose collection she doesn't have control. But for Jeremy, these gaps were actually kind of having the effect of opening up new areas of work that him and his colleagues were going to have to start doing. He was kind of aware of the gaps, but he felt like filling these gaps was something that was possible to do. And part of his work was thinking about, right, how am I going to establish the relationships within the city with the kinds of people I need to establish relationships with in order to fill these gaps. So what I don't want to kind of give the impression is that that smart city discourses are wrong because there just isn't data about the city. I'm more interested in the fact that in spite of a proliferation of lots of different data that exists, the actual utility of that data is not self-evident. Yeah. Okay, so for the people who are working with this data, the data wasn't a problem because it was abundant. It was an issue because where it really mattered for them to have data, that nobody had thought of producing the data that they needed. Okay, so how are we doing for time? Okay, I'm taking ages. Okay. So I'm going to kind of make 2 more points and then I'll wrap up. So So one way in which we might think about this experience of working with data is to think what it tells us about the expectations that people have of data in urban settings, and the way in which these expectations or kind of imaginaries of data play into urban politics. Data was clearly accepted as people who I was working with as absolutely central to it was an absolutely central thing that the city needed to have, and not having it was definitely seen as something that needed to be rectified. So one effect then of this kind of struggle to think, okay, how are we going to kind of bring the city into alignment with our imagination of what it should be, was to make those people who were seen as very successful at identifying and producing data to kind of appear on the scene as new kinds of social and political actors. So there were a number of companies and institutions in the city who were producing new forms of data, who started to actually take on governmental kind of responsibilities and roles that they hadn't previously had. One of these institutions was a company who provided resource efficiency advice to companies. So they went into organizations and they said to them, okay, you want to make your company more streamlined and more efficient, and we'll help you do that by making sure that you use less paper, that you save on your energy, save on your bills. And so what they did is they put together a database of all of the interventions that they'd done with all of these companies. And this database had kind of 36,000 entries, which looked at a particular technology that had been put into that company. So, for example, an energy-saving light bulb, and it had calculated what cost savings and what CO2 savings had actually been achieved through the implementation of these particular technologies. Now, what was interesting to me was that this database that this company had put together had subsequently been taken up by the UK government Department for Energy and Climate Change, and this data was now being used to inform and improve something that the government produces called conversion factors, which is a standardized way of determining what kind of counts as an energy efficient measure. So you had an organisation who, because of the paucity of data in this particular field, were coming into a direct relationship with central government organisations that they had never had this direct relationship with. There was another example of this was a cooperative organisation in the city who were also engaged in thinking about how data could be better used in this field. And they were also working on buildings. And they were putting energy saving measures into various different buildings. Now, this cooperative organisation were very frustrated with the way in which the government was determining whether or not a building was more or less energy efficient, and they also came up with a new kind of methodology and model for analysing the energy efficiency of buildings. And they were also in close conversation with the Department for Energy and Climate Change, who it turned out didn't really know how to be doing any of this modelling work themselves. So you had this situation where these small organisations, often with quite activist people in them, were informing central government policy in an interesting kind of reversal of the way in which I think we think politics happens. Okay, so you had this kind of reorganisation of data going on. And the final thing that I want to point to then was that this was kind of making people feel like they didn't really know who or what were the institutions that they needed to contact or know about to understand not just what data they needed, but even where they could find this data. And so the very last thing I want to touch on is the people who took it upon themselves, or whose role it was to map the very field of kind of data production in the city. So there was one woman who I spoke to who was involved in an organisation that worked with the city council to ensure that the city was reducing its carbon emissions by 41%, which is what they said they were going to do. And she was the data officer, so I was interested in what kinds of data she was working with. When we met up, she explained to me that her role was one of creating an evidence base upon which urban policy about climate change could be made. And she said there were kind of various other people in the city who were doing the same thing. So she described her role as one of mapping out and creating what she called a baseline of evidence, so that, to quote her, so that when people say, is there any evidence, I can say yes. And she then said to me, so this is gonna help people, because if you haven't got any evidence for a priority, then your head just spins like round and round and you don't know where you're going. So this is like kind of totally a way in which people were thinking about their experiences of working in the city. So data wasn't just this kind of numerical practices of modelling and mapping, but it was also producing a terrain unto itself that various people working with climate data were trying to make sense of and navigate and turn to their own kind of political ends. And I think this was partly because one thing that was kind of incontrovertible in the whole process was that data must be central to the process of governing climate change. So Helena said to me in our meeting, this woman who was trying to map out data, it makes common sense to think, okay, if a city's got a nice green environment, then it's a nicer place to be. It's going to make people feel better. It's going to help with the house prices. It's going to attract workers or retain workers, which is what the Economic Development Agency wants. So that makes sense. But you can't just say that. You have to put the numbers on it. But then she went on, because we were talking about transport. But I haven't found the transport data. But I am pretty sure it's there. I just haven't looked for it because I'm so sure it's there. Data on sustainable transport, it is there, but with privatisation, which is what had happened in the city, it really takes a lot of effort to find it. So this kind of quote pulls together, I think, various issues that have run through all these examples, which is a really powerful expectation and commitment to a belief in data. So in each example, there's a real commitment to the importance of data and its capacity for reinstating some kind of coherence to the city in the face of all kinds of uncertainties, and in this case, in the face of the uncertainty of climate change. So we saw this in terms of engaging a city whose climate future is uncertain, in terms of a city that needs to be governed in particular ways, and so on. So we have then this kind of powerful imaginary of data that's really orienting practices of making a sustainable city, at least in Manchester's case. However, I think what we find is also that in spite of this expectation that the data will be there, people are repeatedly confronted by the unavailability of the kind of data they need to produce stable images of future forms of urban living. So the work of governing then, in this case, was a kind of rearguard action against data gaps and information incommensurabilities and empirical obstacles that people were countenancing, that wasn't countenanced within an image of this data-rich city. So, in addition, the value attached to the production of data in the face of these gaps also seemed to open up the space for these new political actors to start to enter the picture. It was those who had the capacity to control and direct and reinforce the imaginary of data that were managing to kind of gain a specific kind of expert power that had the capacity to at times transcend quite embedded traditional institutional political boundaries. Possibly those boundaries that the kind of more political economy approaches start their analysis with. Okay, so I started with this image of the smart city where the question of governing is seen as a question of how to analyse all this data that's going to be available. But far from finding those who are in a position of power being the people who are kind of have this kind of I'm thinking of the language of cybernetics, like the steersman kind of overview of all the data of the city. Actually what we find is it's those who find ways of smoothing over and re-establishing the power of data itself that are gaining a space for participation in practices of government. And I found this myself, being a qualitative researcher, that it's almost impossible to make one's findings and one's interventions heard in a space where numerical data really has a cachet and qualitative data can't translate into the kinds of data imaginaries of urban governance. So I think data is certainly a part of an urban assemblage, but I'm not sure about whether we should approach it as a material like any other, because I think that potentially underplays this imaginary of data. I don't know how you can kind of get at the imaginations of data if we've just focused on data as a material kind of part of assemblages. And I think given that there are these people who can sustain this imaginary and that they're really powerful actors in contemporary urban spaces, this is going to be kind of crucial as we go forward and think about what's happening in the kind of proposition for the smart city being the future of the city. So, finished.